Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The Philippine Airlines Boeing 777 cut silently through the clouds over the Pacific Ocean, carrying its 300 passengers toward Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Manila. Among them, discreetly seated in economy class seat 12A, was Emmanuel Dapidran Pacquiao, known worldwide as Manny Pacquiao. Wearing a simple navy blue polo shirt and faded jeans, the legendary boxer appeared to be just another ordinary Filipino returning home after a business trip. Manny had purposefully chosen to travel in economy class, as he always did when not on official business. For him, this was a way to remain connected with his people, to remember where he came from, and to never forget the days when he didn't even have money for a bus ticket. His advisors had insisted he fly first class, but Manny had gently refused. He wanted to feel at home, among ordinary people, away from the spotlights and pomp that frequently accompanied his public life. The flight had taken off from Los Angeles 3 hours earlier, and Manny gazed through the window at the infinite ocean waters while reflecting on the past few months. He had just finished important meetings about his philanthropic projects in California, discussing the expansion of educational programs for underprivileged children in the Philippines. Each conversation, each plan drawn up, represented an opportunity to give back to the country that had shaped and supported him throughout his entire career. Beside him, an elderly woman slept peacefully, clutching a small crocheted purse that reminded Manny of his mother Dionysia's creations. Across the aisle, a young father tried to calm his softly crying baby, while the mother organized diapers and bottles with tired but loving movements. The scene deeply touched Manny's heart, instantly transporting him to memories of when Jinky cared for their own children during family travels. The boxer closed his eyes for a moment, allowing memories to flow freely. He thought of Jimuel, his eldest son, who was now pursuing his own dreams in basketball. He remembered Michael, always questioning and intelligent, Princess with her radiant smile, little Queen Elizabeth with her strong personality, and Israel, the youngest, who still called him a hero. Each of them represented a reason why he continued fighting, not just in the ring, but in life. The plane's gentle turbulence brought him back to the present. Manny adjusted his seatbelt and noticed how the other passengers seemed relaxed and confident. Many were sleeping, others reading books or watching movies on their personal devices. There was something comforting about that normalcy, that simplicity he valued so much. There, in that space suspended between two worlds, he wasn't the senator, the world champion, or the national icon. He was simply a man returning home. His hands, marked by decades of intense training and epic battles, rested calmly on his knees. Each scar, each callus, told a story of determination and sacrifice. Manny discreetly observed the other passengers, imagining their own stories, their struggles, their dreams. He saw in their faces the same resilience that had carried him from the streets of General Santos City to the pinnacle of boxing glory. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight entered its cruising phase. Flight attendants began moving through the aisles, offering beverages and snacks to passengers. Manny watched them work with professional efficiency, remembering his own humble beginnings when every job, no matter how small, was a blessing. He had swept floors, sold cigarettes on street corners and done whatever was necessary to help his family survive. Now, as one of the flight attendants approached his row, Manny prepared to politely decline any special treatment, preferring to blend in with the crowd of ordinary travelers making their way home to the Philippines. The flight attendant approaching Manny's row was a woman in her early 30s named Christina, her uniform impeccably pressed and her hair pulled back in a tight bun that emphasized the stern expression permanently etched on her face. She had been working for Philippine Airlines for 8 years, and in that time, she had developed a particular disdain for what she perceived as ordinary passengers who didn't appreciate the privilege of flying. Her movements were sharp and efficient, but lacked the warmth typically expected from airline staff. Christina had noticed the man in 12A when she first walked through the cabin during boarding. His simple clothing and quiet demeanor had immediately categorized him in her mind as just another working-class Filipino, probably returning from some menial job abroad. She had seen thousands like him over the years, and her patience for their requests and needs had worn thin long ago. The fact that he was traveling alone in economy class without the usual entourage that accompanied important passengers, only reinforced her assumption about his social status. As she reached Manny's row, Christina's attention was momentarily diverted by a passenger in first class who had pressed his call button. The interruption irritated her, as she was already behind schedule with the beverage service. She glanced dismissively at Manny, who was quietly reading a small book about child development, research for one of his educational foundation projects. The sight of him absorbed in reading somehow annoyed her further, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Manny looked up as Christina's shadow fell across his seat, offering her the same gentle smile he gave to everyone he encountered. His eyes, weathered by countless battles but still holding an unmistakable kindness, met hers with genuine warmth. He had always believed that treating service workers with respect and gratitude was not just proper etiquette, but a reflection of one's character. Having worked in service positions himself during his youth, he understood the challenges these professionals faced daily. The elderly woman beside Manny stirred slightly in her sleep, and he instinctively lowered his voice and movements to avoid disturbing her rest. This small gesture of consideration was automatic for him, born from years of being mindful of others, comfort and well-being. He had learned early in life that true strength often manifested in gentleness, and that power was best demonstrated through service to others rather than dominance over them. Christina's expression remained cold as she mechanically recited the beverage options, her tone suggesting that she was doing him a favor by even acknowledging his presence. Her body language conveyed impatience and superiority, as if serving passengers in economy class was beneath her station. She tapped her pen against her service tray with obvious irritation, glancing frequently toward the first-class cabin, where she clearly preferred to focus her attention. Manny politely requested a simple glass of water, adding a quiet thank you that seemed to go unnoticed by the flight attendant. He had always been particular about staying hydrated during long flights, a habit developed during his boxing career when proper hydration was crucial for performance and recovery. The request was simple and reasonable, yet Christina's reaction suggested he had asked for something extraordinarily complicated. Other passengers in nearby rows began to take notice of the interaction, sensing an unusual tension in what should have been a routine beverage service. A businessman across the aisle looked up from his laptop, while a young mother holding her sleeping toddler glanced over with curiosity. The atmosphere in the immediate area shifted subtly, as people unconsciously tuned into the dynamic unfolding between the flight attendant and the quiet passenger in 12A. Christina's movements became increasingly brusque as she prepared to fulfill Manny's simple request. Her frustration seemed disproportionate to the situation, suggesting deeper issues with her attitude toward passengers she deemed unworthy of her time and attention. The contrast between Manny's patient demeanor and her obvious irritation created a palpable tension that began to spread through the surrounding seats. As she reached for a plastic cup, Christina's expression darkened further, as if the very act of serving this particular passenger was a personal affront to her dignity. The stage was set for an encounter that would soon reveal the true character of both individuals involved. Christina's hand trembled slightly with irritation as she reached for the water pitcher, her movements deliberately slow and exaggerated to demonstrate her displeasure with having to serve what she considered an insignificant passenger. The plastic cup she selected was grabbed with unnecessary force, and she filled it only halfway, as if even the water itself was too precious to waste on someone she deemed unworthy of proper service. When she turned back toward Manny, her expression had hardened into something approaching contempt. Without any attempt at courtesy, she practically slammed the half-filled cup onto his tray table, causing a small splash that dampened the pages of his book. The action was so abrupt and disrespectful that several nearby passengers immediately looked up from their activities, sensing that something inappropriate had just occurred. Manny's reaction was one of quiet surprise rather than anger. He had experienced discrimination and disrespect many times throughout his life, particularly during his impoverished youth, but it never failed to sadden him when people chose cruelty over kindness. He gently moved his book aside to prevent further damage and looked up at Christina with the same patient expression he had maintained throughout the encounter. The flight attendant's behavior escalated as she noticed Manny's calm response. Perhaps expecting him to react with anger or complaint, his continued politeness seemed to fuel her irritation further. She made an exaggerated show of wiping her hands on her apron, as if serving him had somehow contaminated her, and rolled her eyes in a gesture clearly intended to humiliate him in front of the other passengers. A middle-aged businessman named Teodoro, seated 2 rows behind, witnessed the entire exchange and felt his blood pressure rise with indignation. He had been traveling frequently for business for over 15 years and had never witnessed such blatant disrespect from airline staff toward a passenger who had done nothing wrong. His wife, Esperanza, sitting beside him, placed a restraining hand on his arm as she sensed his impulse to intervene. Across the aisle, a young teacher named Marilu, returning from a conference in the United States, felt her heart sink as she watched the humiliating treatment unfold. She had taught her students about dignity and respect for all people, regardless of their apparent social status, and seeing those values violated so publicly made her feel physically ill. Her hands clenched involuntarily as she struggled with whether to speak up. Christina's final act of disrespect came when she deliberately turned her back on Manny without acknowledging his quiet thanks, making it clear to everyone watching that she considered him beneath her notice. She began to move toward the next row with an air of superiority, apparently satisfied with her demonstration of power over someone she perceived as powerless. The elderly woman beside Manny, whose name was Remedios, had awakened during the commotion and witnessed the tail end of the humiliating encounter. Her weathered hands shook with emotion as she recognized the profound injustice of what had just occurred. Having lived through decades of social inequality and discrimination, she understood the deeper implications of such treatment and felt a maternal instinct to protect this kind stranger who had been so considerate of her rest. Throughout the cabin, a subtle shift in atmosphere began to take place. Passengers who had witnessed the incident exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust to barely contained anger. The collective sense of injustice was palpable, as decent people recognized that they had just witnessed something fundamentally wrong. Manny himself remained composed, though those observant enough could see a flicker of deep sadness in his eyes. This wasn't about his ego or status, but about the broader implications of how people treated one another. He had dedicated his life to lifting others up, and encounters like this reminded him of how much work remained to be done in building a more compassionate world. The stage was now set for a revelation that would transform this moment of cruelty into something far more significant. The transformation began with Remedios, the elderly woman seated beside Manny. As she fully awakened and adjusted her glasses, her eyes focused more clearly on her seatmate's profile. Something about his features, the gentle curve of his smile, and the distinctive shape of his eyes triggered a memory that made her heart skip a beat. She had seen that face countless times before, not in person, but on television screens across the Philippines during some of the most glorious moments in their nation's sporting history. Her weathered hand moved instinctively to cover her mouth as the realization dawned. This quiet, humble man, who had just been treated with such disrespect, was none other than Emmanuel Pacquiao, the pride of the Philippines, the 8-division world champion who had brought honor to their country on the global stage. The same man who had risen from absolute poverty to become one of the most celebrated athletes in the world, yet still chose to fly economy class and treat everyone with kindness and respect. Remedios' eyes filled with tears as she understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. Here was a man who had donated millions to charity, built schools and hospitals, and dedicated his post-boxing career to public service, being humiliated by someone who had no idea of his identity or contributions. The irony was almost too painful to bear. Across the aisle, Teodoro had been studying Manny's face with growing recognition. As a lifelong boxing fan who had watched every one of Pacquiao's major fights, he began to notice the unmistakable features that had graced magazine covers and billboards throughout Asia. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he felt a surge of shame for not intervening earlier when he witnessed the disrespectful treatment. The recognition spread like ripples through the cabin as more passengers began to take notice. A young overseas Filipino worker named Bayani, returning home after 2 years in Dubai, felt his breath catch as he recognized the man he had idolized since childhood. Manny Pacquiao had been his inspiration during the darkest moments of homesickness and hardship abroad, representing hope that a poor Filipino could achieve greatness through determination and hard work. Marilu, the teacher, felt her hands tremble as she realized she was in the presence of someone she had used as an example of perseverance and humility in her classroom lessons. She had told her students countless stories about Manny's journey from selling cigarettes on the streets to becoming a world champion, emphasizing how he never forgot his roots or stopped helping others despite his success. A Filipino-American businessman named Isagani, who had been working on his laptop, looked up and felt a jolt of recognition that made him close his computer immediately. He had attended one of Manny's fights in Las Vegas years ago and remembered being moved not just by the athletic performance, but by the champion's gracious behavior toward fans and opponents alike. The collective realization created an electric tension throughout the economy section. Passengers began whispering to their companions, pointing discreetly, and sharing their disbelief that the legendary Manny Pacquiao was sitting among them, having just been treated with shocking disrespect by a flight attendant who clearly had no idea who he was. A young mother named Estrella, traveling with her infant son, felt tears spring to her eyes as she remembered how Manny's success had given her hope during her own struggles with poverty. She had named her son Miguel partly in honor of the champion's fighting spirit, and seeing him treated so poorly felt like a personal attack on everything he represented to struggling Filipinos everywhere. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavy, with a mixture of awe, indignation, and anticipation. Passengers who had been minding their own business moments before now found themselves united in a shared sense of witnessing something significant. The quiet murmur of recognition began to build, creating an undercurrent of energy that would soon demand acknowledgement. Manny himself remained unaware of the growing recognition around him, continuing to read his book with the same peaceful demeanor he had maintained throughout the encounter. The recognition spread through the economy cabin like wildfire, passenger by passenger, row by row, creating an almost palpable energy that seemed to charge the very air around them. What had begun as isolated moments of individual realization was rapidly becoming a collective awakening that would soon reach a critical mass. Remedios, unable to contain her emotions any longer, gently tapped Manny's arm and gestured toward herself with a look of profound respect and gratitude. Her eyes conveyed everything she couldn't put into words: the admiration of an entire nation, the pride of a grandmother who had watched him fight for the Philippines, and the deep shame she felt for how he had been treated. Manny responded with his characteristic humble smile, placing a gentle finger to his lips in a gesture that asked for discretion, not wanting to create a disturbance on the flight. Behind them, Teodoro had quietly informed his wife Esperanza of their fellow passenger's identity, and she immediately understood why her husband had been so agitated by the flight attendant's behavior. As a nurse who had worked with underprivileged communities, she had always admired Manny's medical missions and charitable work in remote areas of the Philippines. Seeing him treated with such disrespect felt like witnessing an assault on everything decent and honorable about their culture. The young teacher, Marilu, found herself fighting back tears as she thought about her students back home, who looked up to Manny as proof that dreams could come true, regardless of one's circumstances. She had shown them videos of his fights, not for the violence, but for the discipline, respect, and sportsmanship he displayed. The contrast between his humble acceptance of mistreatment and the flight attendant's arrogant behavior created a powerful lesson about character that she knew she would carry with her forever. Bayani, the overseas worker, felt a surge of protective instinct toward the man who had unknowingly carried him through his darkest moments abroad. During lonely nights in Dubai, he had watched Manny's fights on his phone, feeling connected to home and reminded that Filipinos could stand proud on the world stage. The thought that this same man had just been humiliated by one of their own countrymen filled him with a righteous anger that was difficult to contain. Word continued to spread through whispered conversations and meaningful glances. A retired teacher named Dolores recognized him from the many times she had used his story to motivate struggling students. A construction worker named Florencio remembered watching Manny's fights with his father before the old man passed away, making this encounter feel almost sacred. A young nurse named Violeta thought of the medical scholarships Manny had funded, including one that had helped her complete her education. The collective energy in the cabin began to shift from recognition to something more powerful, a shared sense of injustice and a growing determination to somehow address what had occurred. Passengers who had never spoken to each other began making eye contact, united in their disbelief and indignation. The normal boundaries between strangers dissolved as they found themselves part of something larger than individual travel plans. Christina, meanwhile, continued her service in the forward section of economy class, completely oblivious to the transformation taking place behind her. She moved with the same arrogant efficiency, treating other passengers with barely concealed disdain, unaware that her earlier behavior had been witnessed by people who now knew exactly who she had disrespected. The tension in the cabin continued to build as more passengers became aware of the situation. A businessman named Gregorio quietly took out his phone, not to record or photograph, but to verify what he could hardly believe. The search results confirming Manny's identity made his hands shake with a mixture of excitement and outrage. The stage was set for a moment that would transform this routine flight into something extraordinary. The tipping point came when Manny, the overseas worker whose emotions had been building since recognizing his childhood hero, could no longer remain silent. Rising slowly from his seat, his hands trembling with a mixture of reverence and indignation, he began to move toward Manny's row. His movement caught the attention of other passengers, who sensed that something significant was about to happen. As Manny approached, other passengers began to follow his lead. Teodoro stood up, his business attire unable to mask the working-class pride he felt for his countrymen. Marilu gathered her courage and rose as well, thinking of all the lessons about respect and dignity she had taught her students. One by one, passengers throughout the economy section began to stand, creating a wave of movement that rippled through the cabin. The sight was extraordinary. Dozens of Filipinos and Filipino-Americans rising from their seats in a spontaneous show of respect and solidarity. Some had tears in their eyes, others wore expressions of fierce pride, but all were united in their recognition of the man who had brought honor to their nation and was now sitting quietly among them, having just endured treatment that no human being deserved. Remedios, despite her age and the difficulty of standing during flight, slowly rose with the help of her armrest, her weathered face glowing with emotion. The young mother Estrella stood while carefully holding her sleeping baby, wanting her child to somehow be part of this moment even in sleep. Construction workers, teachers, nurses, business people, all barriers of class and profession dissolved as they stood together in recognition of true greatness. The movement spread beyond the immediate area where Manny sat. Passengers several rows away, having heard whispered explanations of what was happening, began to stand as well. The wave of recognition and respect moved through the cabin like a living thing, transforming the atmosphere from ordinary travel routine to something approaching reverence. Manny himself looked around in surprise and growing emotion as he realized what was happening. His humble nature made him uncomfortable with such displays, but the genuine love and respect emanating from his fellow passengers was impossible to ignore. He could see in their faces the same struggles he had known, the same dreams he had carried, and the same pride in their shared heritage. The silence that followed was profound and meaningful. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness or uncertainty, but the silence of deep respect and shared understanding. In that moment, the cabin became a sacred space where the true values of Filipino culture, respect for elders, honor for those who serve others, and recognition of genuine achievement, were being demonstrated in their purest form. Christina, still working in the forward section, remained completely unaware of the transformation taking place behind her. She continued her service with the same dismissive attitude, having no idea that she had just disrespected one of the most beloved figures in Philippine history, or that dozens of witnesses were now standing in silent testimony to her behavior. The moment stretched on, heavy with meaning and emotion, as an entire section of the aircraft paid homage to a man who had never asked for special treatment but had earned it through a lifetime of service to others. The profound silence that had enveloped the economy section finally reached the forward part of the cabin, where Christina was mechanically serving beverages to passengers in the premium economy rows. The unusual quiet behind her gradually penetrated her consciousness, causing her to pause mid-pour and glance back toward the source of the strange atmosphere. What she saw made her freeze completely. Nearly the entire economy section was standing in what appeared to be a coordinated display of respect, all facing toward the area where she had just served that unremarkable passenger in 12A. The sight was so unexpected and unprecedented that her mind struggled to process what could possibly be causing such behavior. Her senior flight attendant named Corazon, who had been working in the galley, emerged to investigate the unusual situation. With 25 years of experience in aviation, she had never witnessed anything like the scene unfolding before her. Her trained eye immediately assessed the situation for potential safety concerns, but what she observed was clearly not a disturbance or emergency. It was something far more significant. Corazon approached one of the standing passengers, a businessman named Hilario, and quietly inquired about the situation. When he whispered the explanation, her face went pale with shock and then flushed with embarrassment as she realized the magnitude of what had occurred. She had heard Christina's dismissive comments about economy passengers earlier in the flight, but she had never imagined that such an attitude would lead to the humiliation of someone so revered. The senior flight attendant's reaction was immediate and decisive. She quickly made her way to the intercom system, her hands shaking slightly as she considered how to address the situation. The weight of representing Philippine Airlines in this moment felt enormous, as she understood that the airline's reputation was now at stake based on one employee's inexcusable behavior. Meanwhile, Christina remained frozen in place, slowly beginning to comprehend that something extraordinary was happening. The pieces began falling into place as she noticed the reverent expressions on the passengers' faces, the way they were all looking toward seat 12AA, and the unmistakable atmosphere of respect and admiration that filled the cabin. A cold dread began to settle in her stomach as she realized that the quiet man she had treated so poorly might not be the ordinary passenger she had assumed. The possibility that she had made a terrible mistake started to dawn on her, though she still couldn't quite grasp the full extent of her error. Passengers throughout the aircraft began to take notice of the unusual situation. Those in first class and business class started turning in their seats, trying to understand what was causing the commotion in economy. Flight attendants from other sections gathered near the galley, whispering among themselves as they tried to piece together what was happening. The captain, alerted by his crew about the unusual passenger behavior, emerged from the cockpit to assess the situation personally. As a Filipino pilot who had followed Manny's career with great pride, his recognition was immediate, and his understanding of the situation's significance was complete. The gravity of what had transpired under his command weighed heavily on his shoulders. Manny himself remained seated, gently gesturing for the standing passengers to sit down, his discomfort with the attention evident in his modest demeanor. But the passengers remained standing, their silent tribute continuing as a powerful statement about respect, dignity, and the recognition of true greatness. The moment had evolved beyond a simple case of poor customer service into something that would be remembered by everyone present. The contrast between Christina's arrogant dismissal and the passengers' reverent recognition created a powerful lesson about the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their apparent status or circumstances. Captain Eduardo Villanueva's voice came over the intercom with a gravity and respect that immediately commanded the attention of every passenger aboard the aircraft. His words, carefully chosen and delivered with the dignity befitting the moment, acknowledged the presence of someone who had brought immeasurable honor to the Philippines and apologized profusely for the treatment he had received. The captain's announcement transformed what had been a spontaneous passenger tribute into an official recognition of the injustice that had occurred. The effect on Christina was immediate and devastating. As the captain's words confirmed her worst fears, she felt her legs weaken and her face drain of all color. The realization that she had humiliated Manny Pacquiao, a man revered not just as an athlete, but as a symbol of Filipino resilience and dignity, hit her like a physical blow. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as the full magnitude of her actions became clear. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had not previously understood the situation now grasped its significance. The spontaneous standing ovation that followed the captain's announcement included nearly every person on the aircraft, creating a thunderous display of respect that seemed to make the very plane vibrate with emotion. First-class passengers, business travelers, and economy passengers all stood united in their recognition of true greatness. Manny's response to this overwhelming display of affection was characteristically humble. He stood slowly, his eyes glistening with emotion, and began to bow respectfully to his fellow passengers. His gesture was not one of acknowledgement of his own importance, but rather an expression of gratitude for their kindness and a recognition of their shared humanity. The sight of this legendary figure showing such humility in the face of adoration moved many passengers to tears. Corazon, the senior flight attendant, approached Manny's row with tears streaming down her face. Her years of professional training had not prepared her for a moment like this, where personal emotion and professional duty intersected so powerfully. She knelt beside his seat, her actions speaking louder than any words could about her respect for him and her shame for her colleagues' behavior. The transformation in the cabin atmosphere was complete and profound. What had begun as a routine flight had become a powerful lesson about respect, humility, and the true meaning of greatness. Passengers found themselves reflecting not just on Manny's achievements in boxing and public service, but on the way he had handled the disrespectful treatment with such grace and dignity. Christina, meanwhile, had retreated to the galley area, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her mistake. Her colleagues maintained a respectful distance, understanding that she needed to process the gravity of what had occurred. The contrast between her earlier arrogance and her current devastation served as a stark reminder of how quickly pride can lead to downfall. As the flight continued toward Manila, the energy in the cabin remained electric with emotion and meaning. Passengers who had been strangers hours earlier now shared a common experience that would bond them forever. Many took out their phones, not to photograph or record, but to message family members about witnessing something truly extraordinary. The young mother Estrella held her baby closer, whispering promises that she would tell him about this day when he was old enough to understand. The teacher Marilu mentally composed the lesson she would share with her students about character, respect, and the importance of treating every person with dignity. The overseas worker Bayani felt a renewed sense of pride in his heritage and determination to carry himself with the same humility and grace he had witnessed. Manny spent the remainder of the flight moving quietly through the cabin, taking time to speak with passengers, sign autographs for children, and pose for respectful photographs with families. His actions demonstrated that true greatness lies not in demanding special treatment, but in using one's position to bring joy and inspiration to others. As the plane began its descent toward Manila, the passengers carried with them more than just their luggage and travel memories. They carried a profound lesson about the power of humility, the importance of respect, and the way that true character reveals itself, not in moments of triumph, but in moments of trial. The flight that had begun as ordinary transportation had become an extraordinary journey of human connection and moral awakening that would resonate in their hearts long after they reached their destination. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.